Good to see everybody. And I'm actually doing this on my computer, which is the first time I've done it this way. And I can now see who is joining us. So it's really great to see everybody. And that is not the case when we're doing it through the Riverside in our little podcast studio. But we're both at home today.
Yeah, and this is I'm loving this. Actually, it's really nice to be able to see people's names like actually popping up.
Right. We may never go back.
Don't
tell the team. The thing is that the reason Ilan and I are like this is we are on our own today, and we had to set this up ourselves and figure out exactly how to connect. And we're free agents right now. Nobody is staffing us. Nobody's keeping an eye on us. This is great.
Yeah, we're gonna say some terrible things. It's gonna be a total mess.
Exactly. All right.
Yeah.
Well, it is Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, which is an unusual time for us to be doing this live. And we're going to send this out to folks so they can catch up over the weekend. But we thought that since 4 p.m. Wednesday this week is New Year's Eve, probably not the best time to be doing a Substack live. And we also thought in the wake of yesterday's meeting in Mar-a-Lago between Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump, that it was a good time for us to share some thoughts with the Substack word on the street live world and with the J Street world and tell you a little bit about what we thought about the meeting. And maybe also this is a good time, Ilan, to share some thoughts at the end of the episode. We'll talk a little bit about 2026 and what we see coming up.
Yeah, I think that it's a good plan. And it was definitely like a weird meeting. I don't know about you, Jeremy, watching the beginning. Watching
the two of them standing there with the identical red tie and white shirt. It's like mini me, it's like the quintessential mini me. Bibi trying so hard to be Donald Trump, and it's really gross. Actually, it's very gross.
Yeah, and it's also the Israel Prize stuff, the flattery, like the blatant flattery. That stuff I also just find kind of yuck, even if maybe substantively things were more interesting, and we don't really know what happened behind closed doors. I think the overall public situation, not so great. But look, maybe it's a good place to
That's a good place to start. Yeah, tell us a little bit about what you heard in their public remarks, and then we've been talking to folks, both reporters and some of the insiders here, about what may have happened behind closed doors since we weren't there. But tell folks a little bit about your take on what we saw publicly and then what might have been happening behind closed doors.
Sure. So look, Netanyahu came with one central objective, which was to look good for Israeli voters right before he goes into an election year, to be getting as tight of a hug as possible from Donald Trump publicly. And he got that. Donald Trump was effusive, positive, talking about how Bibi saved Israel. I mean, frankly, to the point of, in my view, being a little bit insulting, because I think Israel is strong enough and thriving and vibrant enough at this point in its history where no prime minister is going to be the decider about whether Israel survives or not. Israel's surviving and continuing to thrive no matter what. But Trump was leaning in with all of that in a very public way, in an obvious way to help Netanyahu with his own domestic politics, talking also about the pardon, which we can get into, and support for the pardon. And so you have that as the public piece of this. And then at the same time, at least the reporting coming out is a lot of disagreements, or at least different positions, not necessarily where Netanyahu would be most comfortable on everything from from Gaza to the West Bank, Turkey, Syria, Iran. I think that's a whole different conversation. So we'll
walk through each one of those.
No, but I think that was a very interesting and different contrast. And it's a pretty old school way of approaching, an Israeli leader, which is public embrace, quiet pressure. Maybe it kind of works with Donald Trump since he's so popular in Israel. I don't think it can work with anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a little bit this weekend about, the way I would imagine how a different type of president. I talked about channeling my inner Rahm Emanuel. I had the opportunity, let's call it that, to work with Rahm 30 years ago and experience what it's like to hear the bluntness and the directness from Rahm. And you talked about how Trump said Israel's never been stronger under this prime minister, and Mr. Prime Minister, you're the greatest, the best, etc. Rahm, in his interview with Pod Save America, and then as the way I wrote it up, he said, on the one hand, Israel is stronger and has a better security situation than it's ever had. But on the other hand, it's never been more isolated, right? This prime minister is leading Israel down a path that is resulting in it not being able to have, as you are often pointing out, its musicians go, to Eurovision, to have its scientists go to conferences, to watch the brain drain happening and the weakness of Israel's position in the world and in the Jewish world. This same prime minister is doing that. And I think that if a president or a Democratic candidate or somebody, we're trying to present a different message to the Israeli public, it's not this prime minister is succeeding. This prime minister is leading you to be a pariah state. This prime minister is weakening Israel more than any prime minister has ever weakened them.
Yeah, and I don't know if we've talked about it on the show before, but I know you and Jeremy, you and I have talked about it before. Eurovision is just, for me, the perfect example of the symbolism.
That's why I raised it. I knew you were going to go there on the Eurovision.
Fixate on Eurovision. Part of it is, when I
challenge though, name me the last Eurovision competitor from Israel.
I don't remember the last, since I don't follow it as close anymore. I know Neda was the last winner.
Yeah. I remember Donna International. That was when I lived there. That was back in the 90s. And that was incredible. She had some great comments on this whole situation herself, actually. So
yeah, no, she did it, which was, to kind of like, at least her message to the Israeli public was, look at the ditch that Netanyahu was digging us into. For me, Eurovision goes back to being 4 years old. On Shabbat, there was no TV in Israel, and so what would I do in the morning? We had a VCR. I'd throw in a tape of Eurovision from the previous year, and I'd watch it like every day.
Yeah.
And
now the idea that Israel's going to be like, eventually not welcome. There are countries that are going to boycott Eurovision because Israel's taking part. And that's just, that's only going to continue over time. And ultimately, Israel's not going to get to participate. And that's just one example, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's either Israel will participate and a bunch of other countries won't, which is happening so far, or Israel will eventually not be able to participate. Right. And it's just really bad either way, right? I mean, either of those outcomes is really terrible. And so this is the world Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir are taking them down. I think privately, Trump and some of his advisors get this more. I'm not sure they fully get it.
What do you think happened behind closed doors? I mean, I think that's the interesting story here. We know what he said publicly, but what do you think was really happening? You've had a couple of conversations quietly with people. What are you hearing?
So, look, my take is, and I think we'll go through it one issue at a time. Maybe let's start with, and you can also read it from just a little bit of what did come out in the press conference where you can see the gaps. Maybe let's start with, do you want to start with Gaza or you want to start with West Bank?
Yeah, let's start with Gaza. The question of Hamas and how to disarm them.
Right. So I think that there's the biggest challenge right now for the Trump team is we need some kind of a deal where the international security force starts to come in and the Israelis start to pull back. Hamas is not going to disarm on day one. It's not going to just give up all of its weapons. It's very ahistorical. But can you have some kind of a process where they give up some weapons up front? Israel, starts to support local Palestinians coming in, some kind of Palestinian police force supported by this international security force. And over time, you start to replace Hamas with something else. Now, of course, Netanyahu is sitting there saying, we're not moving 1 inch until Hamas totally disarms, which is entirely impractical. And Hamas is out there saying we're not going to disarm. And so this is the challenge for the Trump team to try to keep, and for President Trump to kind of try to keep moving this forward on a piecemeal budget, on a piecemeal kind of way. The other things you keep hearing from Netanyahu was, the last hostage, the deceased hostage has to come home before we can move on to phase 2, which I think is, look, I obviously want the last hostage to come home. He should be home.
We all absolutely.
But this phase 2 is not a gift to Hamas. Phase 2 is the beginning of the plan to get rid of Hamas. And so, and it's a plan to replace Hamas with a better alternative inside of Gaza. And so to say, we're not going to do that because you haven't brought home the last hostage, which is unclear where the last hostage is, Rangvili, is completely counterproductive. And again, an excuse by Netanyahu, because I think he's really happy to just control 50% of Gaza, have Hamas control the other 50%, have this become the new status quo, instead of the alternative where you start to build a Palestinian alternative, which then forces you down the pathway of all the other things we want to see afterwards in a part of the peace plan.
And you had Trump, sort of bloviating about how other countries, if Hamas doesn't disarm, then its patron countries are going to go in and do it for them, as if, the Arab and Muslim world is lining up, just waiting to be asked to send troops into Gaza to disarm Hamas, which is the exact opposite of what is happening, right? The countries don't want to send their troops in unless they know that there's actually a political pathway here, that there's actually a route towards a political long-term endgame, and they won't do it because Israel and Netanyahu in particular are not willing to give that endgame and are not willing to give anything that would allow the PA in or would begin the process of setting up a government structure that would replace Hamas.
Yeah, and look, there's a lot of challenges on both sides here. I think Qatar and Egypt and Turkey really need to press Hamas to essentially agree to let this force in and not fire on it, and agree to let other Palestinian security forces start to take over pieces of Gaza and pull back. That's a big ask of Hamas, but I think they are weak enough and they are isolated enough where if everybody put the pressure on them to do it. But that's not going to happen if Netanyahu and Israel don't do their half of this, which is, starting to be willing to withdraw, starting to allow more aid. I mean, they're still not even owning up to the piece of the deal where Rafah is supposed to be open. In both.
And by the way, I don't know if you saw the latest, which is this banning that Israel has issued a list of dozens of NGOs that are providing humanitarian aid that they are now going to bar from working in Gaza, and claiming that they have terrorist ties, including Doctors Without Borders and other Oxfam, just basic major international NGOs that work all over the world. And Israel's now going to ban them, claiming that they have ties to terror. That was just announced this morning. I hope, again, that this is going to be something that the administration is going to lean in heavily. I saw most of the Western countries have already condemned this, and I, of course, didn't see anything from our State Department. But, this is going to be an ongoing battle with the Netanyahu government. But let's shift over to the West Bank. The West Bank, you and I and J Street have really been focusing a lot of attention on, just as everybody's focused on Gaza, just how awful everything is on the West Bank. And this has not been a topic that the Trump administration, either in term one or term two, has really been all that interested in engaging on. What we heard a little bit publicly, and we're hearing happen privately, is the administration is beginning to recognize that if the West Bank blows up, everything they've been trying to put together in terms of Gaza and a regional deal is going to blow up with it. So I don't know if you wanted to comment a little bit on some of what you've been hearing about the West Bank and the Trump team's sudden attention to it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually thought that was maybe the most interesting part of the public remarks, is at one point when Trump was asked about the West Bank, he did say, well, we have some disagreements there. I'm going to leave those for private discussion. And it seems like, as you said, that Trump's team pushed Bibi on settler violence, on settlements, on all of it, and are recognizing, look, PA needs to also do reform. And I think that the reforms that Netanyahu and the Trump team want are probably pretty narrow and very focused on Israeli desires. And also, frankly, like for Netanyahu, like reform is a thing that will never actually happen. It will never be good enough. It just becomes an excuse. And so the question is whether, Trump and his team are going to be witting enough to actually take yes for an answer, especially when they're hearing, from others, especially from the Saudis and Jordanians, Egyptians. But, at the same time, you also are going to need the Israelis. The way you've seen it quoted in a few different places is take their feet off the Palestinians' necks. That's what, there's a senior Trump administration official is out there being quoted on that in a few different places. And that's a positive development as far as I'm concerned. As I'm sure
Yeah.
you are too. Like, at least get them there. I still think they're not, not where we are, certainly the Trump administration, but for the first time in all 4 years of the first term and year of the second term,
Well, I
to
think, you and I have discussed this, that, I think there is a split within the administration. At the beginning of the administration, I talked about the Knights of the Round Table. There were like 5 different types of perspectives within the Trump world, but I certainly see 2 very clear camps within Trump world. You've got sort of the Mike Huckabee camp, and a lot of the evangelical movement, the most conservative of the Jewish advisors, who really do believe in greater Israel, do believe that God granted the West Bank to Israel and it should be part of a single state. And you've got that camp firmly within Israel that does not want to give up any of Judea and Samaria, as they call it, and believes that this is part of the state of Israel. And then you've got the other camp, which is the deal makers, right? I mean, and that, I think that's where Kushner and Witkoff fall. I think they have very practical sensibilities. I don't agree with their politics, obviously, on anything, worldwide. But when it comes to trying to strike this deal, I think that, there is a practical camp that doesn't want to see things come into play that are going to blow up the deal they're trying to get to. And then there's an ideological camp that is really not interested in a deal, and really, will take any opportunity, I think, to let it get derailed, so that the ever increasing annexation that is taking place day in and day out on the West Bank can just continue apace. And that's going to be a push-pull within the administration, I think, for the months ahead.
Yeah, I think that's 100% right, and basically where we are. And I don't know, brain freeze for half a second here, Jeremy. But
Well, let's broaden out from Gaza and the West Bank. And, we've talked a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian front, but I think some of the more interesting things that happened in the press conference, but also that are happening in the U.S.-Israel relationship, is the different way that this administration looks at other regional actors. For instance, Turkey, for instance, the new Syrian government under al-Shara, and also, frankly, Lebanon. And I think on each of those 3, that there is a gap between where the Netanyahu world is and where the Trump administration wants it to be. And frankly, some of the Gulf states as well want it to be. So I don't know if you wanted to sort of do the circle here, but let's start with Turkey. And Trump, is a huge Erdogan fan, right? And I'd say if there's one thing Israel's been making really clear, they don't want Turkey in the stabilization force. They don't want Turkish troops on the ground in Gaza. Yet Turkey's one of the few competent militaries that's actually said they'd be willing to put troops on the ground. So that's one area, I think, where there's a real, coming to loggerheads moment. What do you think about Turkey?
Yeah, no, and Trump has apparently had something like 8 calls with Erdogan over the last 3 months. Is like somebody told me that at some point. And they really do see eye to eye. Frankly, like kind of these authoritarian Erdogan and Trump, right? I mean, Trump connects with these authoritarians, whether it's Putin, whether it's Erdogan, whether it's Netanyahu, these kind of guys who really aren't interested in democracy and really are interested in squeezing their populations. He likes these guys. He respects this. I guess he sees it as strength and power, and it's what he wants in the United States. But on Turkey, Turkey played a critical role in getting the ceasefire because they have a lot of leverage on Hamas. They are not trusted, not just by Netanyahu, but there's not a lot of trust, I think, from the Israeli security establishment writ large towards Turkey. But what you saw Trump saying in the press conference at one point he was talking about how Erdogan helped overthrow Assad, how fantastic he is. Then he said, and I know Bibi agrees with me on this.
Right.
He kind of
that moment,
nodding and sitting there, not really saying anything, but Bibi does not agree with this.
Right. And that happened a few times. That was a dynamic several times where Trump just sort of lays something out there and says, and I know Bibi agrees and Bibi does not agree, and he'll just smile and nod.
Yeah, and then is all the press. It was interesting. Also, we're talking about this particular dynamic is, the way it was covered in the Israeli press, where you clearly have the pro-Bibi press who is all just fawning and taking it all in, and there's no better relationship between Netanyahu and Trump. And then you have the actual analysts who are just picking through issue by issue the distance between these two guys. So yeah, Turkey, that's going to be a big one. I don't know if you need Turkey as part of this coalition that goes in as part of the ISF, but certainly they could be incredibly valuable if the Israelis are comfortable with it, because they actually have one of the biggest army militaries in NATO. They understand, they have a relationship with Hamas to the point where Hamas won't fire on them, which I actually think is really important. And they're willing to go in and have operated in tough spaces. So I could see it working, but it's precisely that relationship with Hamas that makes the Israelis very skeptical. But
right, Erdogan has been a huge critic of Netanyahu and a huge critic of this government and the way it treats the Palestinians, and they have made the Palestinian cause a champion issue for themselves in their domestic politics. So, there is a lot of tension in this relationship. Go back to the flotilla of 2009 or 10 or whenever that exactly was. And this has been a very rocky 15 years between Turkey and Israel, whereas prior to that, there had been a real thawing of the relations, and you actually thought that Turkey and Israel were going to form a real stronger bond. So that's a fascinating thing. I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everybody for joining us. You're with us on Word on the Street Live. We're doing a special edition today on Tuesday just to give folks our readout on the Trump-Bibi meeting yesterday, and because tomorrow is New Year's Eve and we're wrapping up 2026. So thank you. We appreciate the love from all of you. If anybody wants to hit the like button and send the hearts out there, we really appreciate that, because it boosts the algorithm and helps us get more traction on Substack itself. So thank you guys for that. And we are discussing some of the regional actors that were referenced during the meeting yesterday, and on which both Trump and Bibi have a slightly different take. And we discussed a bit Erdogan and Turkey, but let's go around over to the East and talk a little bit about Lebanon and Syria in particular. I think that's another really interesting one. You want to give us a little rundown on what the differing perspectives of Trump and Netanyahu are when it comes to Shara and the new Syria?
Right. So, look, on Syria again, and on Netanyahu has been incredibly skeptical, incredibly cautious, and also at the same time aggressive in terms of his relationship with Shara and concerns that, Shara has his history as, it boggles the mind. 15 years ago, he was the head of Syria, right? I mean, or 10 years ago. And now here he is running the country, and we're removing sanctions and embracing the guy, and he's making the right noises. And so there's some skepticism, which I think is justifiable. But what's happened is, I think Netanyahu and his advisors have taken a very aggressive approach in Syria to try to create a buffer zone, to militarily intervene in ways that I think the Trump administration finds destabilizing. The Trump administration's approach, heavily influenced by lobbying from Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, has been to give Shara a chance to remove sanctions, to see if you can actually make Syria work. And this has been a constant disagreement, where the concern from the Trump administration has been, this is, a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you aggressively go into Syria in ways that destabilize it, like, we have to actually work for a better outcome here. And I think that I have a feeling Trump kind of got what he wanted on this one, because they've made this one a big priority. The administration's envoy, Tom Barrack, has been out there very publicly disagreeing with Netanyahu. He's very much, Jeremy, you talked about the deal makers and the ideologues. Barrack is very much, in the deal maker camp, right? And, you hear him talking about, I think it's him. That's my theory, is that it's him. Somebody's been quoted as saying Bibi is chasing ghosts in Syria. Shara is now quoting it and saying that. And so there wasn't as much public talk about it, but I do hope that, I think the Trump team put down a pretty hard marker on that one. Although I don't think I saw Barrack in the meeting, which was kind of interesting in and of itself. But,
and he's the ambassador to Turkey. His day job is actually to be the ambassador to Turkey. So it's interesting. He's also the envoy on Syria, which is, another fascinating component of all of this. So finally, let's over to Lebanon, where we've got some deadlines that are right now, I think, in terms of markers on disarmament of Hezbollah and the things that the Lebanese government is supposed to have done. The Lebanese government is holding press conferences to highlight that they're actually doing the things that they're supposed to do on the ground. It doesn't necessarily appear that they're doing the things that they're supposed to do. And Israel is egging on a little bit to say, you haven't met these markers and we may need to go in and do something. But there's clearly friction and tension there about how far along we are in the disarmament process of Hezbollah. I think the difference here is you've got an actual government with an actual armed forces that has a legitimate desire. These are often led by Christian forces in Lebanon who have a real desire to see the Shiite militia disarmed. And so I think there are forces that have real legitimacy and real power on the ground interested in disarmament. I think that's very different from what you've got in Gaza, obviously, where you just don't have any form of legitimate local government structure that's going to lead the disarmament. So what's your take on where we're at? And you were at the Doha conference recently, and I'm sure you heard a lot about what's going on in Lebanon. What are you hearing about how that process is going?
I mean, believe it or not, didn't hear as much. Lebanon was not nearly as exciting on the list, right?
I assumed that would be big.
Between Gaza and Syria, those were like the issues. The Lebanese prime minister was also there. He got like a lot less of a reception than Shara did, which is pretty interesting in of itself. But look, this is going to be a slow, complicated process. And I do think that the war with Hezbollah last year knocked them back. I think you have a functioning government. This is a years-long process, right? This is where Israel demands immediate disarmament. And if we don't hit this criteria and we don't meet it, then everything breaks down and we just got to go back to fighting, which is not necessarily what the Israeli government is, although that's where kind of the right-wingers huff and puff and say they are. Like, this is a years-long process that's going to take, and as long as you're making progress and you're keeping Hezbollah weak and you're trying to build up the alternative, that's the only way this works, right? I think you look at a place like Syria, you look at a place like Iraq, and I think it's going to translate to Gaza too, right? That you have to invest in alternative governance and security structures. They are going to be imperfect. You always put dates on a calendar because it kind of forces people to move forward, but you never actually, I will tell you, the marker is not whether or not you've met the specific date and the specific deadline, therefore, or else we go and all blow it up. Like, is the arrow pointing in the right direction or is it pointing in the wrong direction? And that's the $1 million question. I'm not expert enough on the ground in Lebanon to really be able to get in there and tell you in the way I am in some of these other places. Like, is it, and it's such complicated politics, is it moving in the wrong direction or the right direction? But that is the right question instead of, well, this is, time to blow it up and go back to have another fight, which again, doesn't get Israel anything. And also, by the way, translates, the other thing we haven't talked about yet, Jeremy, I'll toss it back to you, is mentality of Iran.
Yeah, I figured we'd end our tour of the region with Iran. You and I were doing these already 6 months ago during the 12-day war, and there's a lot of a lot of argument. And I know I see some folks who are in the room with us here now, who disagree with us on this. That I think you and I both felt that the strike on Iran, while it felt good at the moment, to see the Iranian ballistic missile capacities damaged and to see sites which were being used for activities that could have been ultimately used to create a weapon, a nuclear weapon, that to see those sites hit, that may feel good in the moment. But the question from a strategic point of view is, have you really actually done something that in the long run is going to mean that the program is set back? And our argument 6 months ago was we set it back for a few months, maybe even a couple of years, but the Iranians now had greater incentive to try to rebuild. They had the opportunity to rebuild without visibility because the inspectors were all out. They had the chance to do it in a different place where we might not even know that it's taking place. And so our whole level of intelligence and visibility and knowledge about what the Iranians were doing was set back. And here we are already only 6 months later, and you already have discussions in front of cameras between these two leaders who were saying the program had been obliterated and were using these definitive verbs to say we're done with Iran, now talking about, well, when's the next strike going to be? When are we going to have to do this again? Which is precisely what we said 6 months ago, that if you don't come to some form of diplomatic understanding with Iran and put inspectors in and really lock their program down and do that for the long run, then this kind of military action is going to come back on a wheel just every 24, 36 months. And unfortunately, every time it happens, you run the risk that it's not contained to 12 days and a limited number of strikes, that something goes awry and it becomes a much larger regional conflict. Thankfully, that didn't happen this summer, which a lot of folks who were pro the strike used against those of us who were against the strike. They said, you said it was all going to implode and go bigger, but that doesn't mean that the next time, something doesn't go wrong and some missile gets through or something flies off course, and the next thing you know, you're in a broader regional conflict. So, I think Iran is back on the radar. Certainly, Netanyahu came to the meeting, as we understand it, intending to enlist U.S. support if they need to take another strike at what's going on, particularly on the ballistic missile front. And I don't know how that went. I haven't read anything. I don't know if you have, about whether or not there was any openness from the Trump team on that.
Yeah, on this one, I don't think you're going to have a big separation between Trump and Netanyahu. I think they're in it now, right? Trump views that war as having been the two things he sees as the biggest successes so far of the administration, at least in terms of foreign policy, are the war with Iran and the Gaza ceasefire. It's kind of interesting, right? Because the lessons of those two things are almost the exact opposite. But he's really invested in this narrative that we destroyed Iran and we can continue to destroy Iran. And I don't think he's walking away from Bibi on that. But I'll say two things about this, Jeremy. One is, we were making this case 6 months ago. We were also making this case 10 years ago. and have been making the case since, right? We're now 10 years since the JCPOA. It was just a much more stable, healthy, reasonable way to control and actually contain the Iranian nuclear program. Donald Trump walked away from it in 2018. We warned then this is where we would be going, and this is where we are. And then the other thing is, these wars, look, even if it is contained, that 12-day war for the Israeli public was incredibly costly and really difficult. This is different than the 2-year war in Gaza in a very significant way, in that those missiles cause everybody to have to sit in shelter for 12 days straight. I had friends in Israel. I'm sure you were talking to friends and family and others who were telling me, this feels like COVID all over again. I'm stuck in a shelter with my kids. I can't go anywhere. Like, we can't have this Israel can't afford this every 6 months or a year, right? Or 2 years even. And all planes shut down for months afterwards, the impact on the economy every time this happens. This is not the type of thing a developed, powerful, strong, secure, integrated into the region country like Israel, which is where we all want it to be, needs to endure every 6 to 12 to 18 months. And there is an alternative pathway, and we're just seeing this again. So for me, the one area that I found the most negative and was most frustrating were the public comments on Iran. It's clear Trump is fully bought in and is stuck with this. He was more hesitant. The one thing he did say I'd be open to doing direct diplomatic talks with Iran. He said that was good, but he's fully, he's fully stuck now with the Netanyahu policy, having embraced it 6 months ago. There's no way out for him. And I think he sees no political way out for him on this. And it's just a very bad trajectory for the U.S.
So we've taken ourselves on a little tour of the region. For those who joined us a little bit later, you can watch the beginning at your leisure. But we've been through Gaza, the West Bank, over to Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Iran. We talked about all of this in the context of the Bibi Trump meeting yesterday. But now let me pull the lens back and just give, in our final couple of minutes here, I want to look ahead to 2026 and put what's happening in the Middle East in the context of what's happening in the world. You have a president who does seem to fancy himself a peacemaker, right? He does love to list off the supposed conflicts that he has helped to resolve. He says 8. I've watched the analysis of those 8, most of which he really had either nothing to do with, or there was no war, or there was no actual end of conflict. So most of those are not real, but this is his vision of himself. Yet we're heading into 2026 with some very, very live conflicts that are running real risk of escalation. And, we can just tick through them for folks. I'm sure you're all watching this carefully, but obviously here in our own hemisphere, we are not only now blowing up boats, but we blew up a dock in Venezuela this week. And so we're now engaged in actual attack on the land of Venezuela. So we've got a hot war going in our own hemisphere. This week, based on a reaction to an $11 billion arms deal with Taiwan that we made, China is conducting its largest live fire exercises ever in the Straits. You've got the Ukraine talks that were in Mar-a-Lago the day before Netanyahu was there. Zelensky was there, but that just doesn't seem to be making forward progress. You've got, we attacked Nigeria this week, and it just feels like the world is a tinderbox at the moment. And so I don't know, going into 2026, Ilan, the great peacemaker and his quest for the Nobel Peace Prize seem a little bit off track at the moment.
Yeah, and the one I'm really watching most carefully, because I think it's the most disturbing, is Venezuela. Like, that's the one that I think, a lot of national security kind of crowd, my kind of national security world, some people might call it the blob, but I'll, if I call it the blob, I do so only kindly and from a position of affection.
Place of love. I love the blob.
In those various signal chats and things, the one that really has people concerned is Venezuela. Because it's what are we doing here? And you just kind of see this escalating, and Trump walking himself, and much with Iran, where he kind of just decided to hop on board with, Trump's instincts are not to go deep and get very involved. He's, pretty isolationist, unilateralist, but he's also such a political creature who needs to be seen as tough and strong, that you can just see him boxing himself in and painting himself into these corners where he does the strong thing and thinks he's done. And then, you're dealing with escalation in the aftermath. I mean, he did it in the first term, with Iran, and after Soleimani, we had just incredible tension in that whole last year of the first Trump administration. In the Biden administration, before October 7th, people forget, we had spent a lot of time de-escalating challenges in the region that we left over from Trump. And he's doing the same thing, again, just I think I like the way you described it, Jeremy. It's just this kind of simmering and bubbling all over. Yeah. But it's Venezuela, because it's also Marco Rubio's got a fascination with Venezuela, and and obviously Cuba is tied to that. And, a lot of people think the road to Cuba goes through Venezuela. I mean, that sounds a lot like, a peace, democracy in the Middle East is going to go through Iraq. For those of us who remember that one, there's a lot, there. It's all tied up in the drugs and immigration and these other deeply problematic things that are central to his identity. I can see just going very, very badly.
So we're headed into 2026. It is an election year in both the United States and in Israel. And here in the United States, you've got a terrain, a playing field that is clearly tilting right now in favor of the Democrats because of the dissatisfaction primarily on the realities of the economy at the gut level, at the actual individual level, even if the macro numbers are coming in well, whether it's GDP or the stock market or other things like that. The top 20% maybe are doing okay, but the bottom 80% are clearly finding it ever harder to make ends meet. When you combine that with a world that's in this tinderbox situation with a president who claimed he was going to get us out of foreign entanglements, yet we're getting sucked in all over the world, and potentially with U.S. troops at risk. So I think 2026 is setting up as a very, very potentially transformative election year because both on the economy and in foreign policy, you have real undercutting of the core messages that got a radical populist and his movement elected. And so I don't know how you're feeling. I think this is going to be a very interesting year. I know I will get at least 5 emails from people watching who will say, but that's only if elections take place. So I'll just put that caveat out there for the 5% of you that don't believe that we're actually going to have elections. But for those of us who are, actually going to try to win these elections, I think this is probably, a really important, opportune year for us. And so as I head into 2026, that's the top of my list. How about you?
Yeah, I was actually just walking the dog this morning, daydreaming to myself, like, as you might do when you're walking a dog sometimes. And I thought, wow, it's going to be 2026 in just a couple of days. And 2026 is only 2 years from 2028. And
Right.
things are feeling better and like looking up a little bit. And
Yeah.
we're now beyond 24 and 25. So I think, I do think there's huge opportunities. I think it's very clear in the polling. I also, if you were paying attention to the big conference, I think it was about a week and a half ago, Turning Point USA had their big conference here. And Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson going at each other very loudly and vociferously about, really on anti-Semitism, racism, and what they're willing to accept inside their movement and not. And you see, Marjorie Taylor Greene. I have not read yet, but a long piece in the New York Times today. I think you see the fracturing of the MAGA movement coming. You see the beginnings of it. Trump is part of the fracturing is precisely what you said, Jeremy, is he's not actually delivering on all the things that he supposedly stands
And he
for.
seems to be missing the moment. Like, he doesn't seem to be getting it. I mean, this whole thing about affordability being a hoax, this is a guy who, if you don't like him and respect him or think anything of him, the one thing you had to give him was he had his finger on his audience. He knew how to read the room, and he could adjust what he said in order to maximize the number of people that would vote for him and like him. But I feel like he lost that in recent months. And this affordability as a hoax thing, it means he's losing his touch too.
Yep. And which happens to presidents as they get further, he's getting older and they get further along. He doesn't actually have to worry about reelection again. And I don't think that you have these. I mean, JD Vance as an heir apparent does not have the charisma. He's just got the scariness, but he doesn't have the charisma, the connection, the instinct, that Trump does, or if it becomes a JD versus Rubio. I do see a comment, and it's actually what I wanted to pick to next, which is like we should talk about 2026 is also election year in Israel. And so,
and I do want to also thank Melody for highlighting the J Street PAC, and we appreciate Melody, and we appreciate all the folks who were on the on the call with us today, who are members of J Street and who make their political contributions to the candidates who are going to be running in these elections here through the J Street PAC. So thank you to Melody. But back to Israel and Deborah's question. Tell us what your take is. We're headed. It finally will happen. There will actually be an election after all these years of people saying, well, elections are just around the corner. Well, they have to take place by October of 2026.
Yeah, although I will say there's probably maybe like 10%. If it's 5% of Americans, you get 10% who will say like there will be no election.
It'll never happen.
And look, I mean, the Israeli system is so much more flexible on elections that I think there's greater need to be worried about that. Nothing has moved Netanyahu's numbers in basically the 2 years since October 7th. The Israeli public does not forgive him for that. And this has been a really bad week for Netanyahu, Trump meeting notwithstanding. This scandal, Qatar Gate. We have all these advisors of his who apparently took money direct from the Qataris. That would be a scandal in the U.S., but Qatar is viewed much more positively in the U.S. than it is viewed in Israel. I think some of that skepticism in Israel is a little unfair, but from a political perspective, I mean, this is a disaster for him, right? I mean, I do think we're in a year where we're treading water on all the things we spent the first half. Like, we're only going to make so much progress because at every step of the way, it's going to have to be, Trump and others dragging Netanyahu, kicking and screaming because he's got to appeal to Smotrich and Ben Gvir. Now, the big question, as it has been, and we're going to be very repetitive about this, folks, I'm sure I've heard it again, is can the opposition get to 61? Are they willing to go in with, Arab politicians? Which, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not sure we've talked about it on.
No, I don't think we have.
Yeah. I'll tell you my opinion about this, Jeremy. It's time for the Israeli left, to just get over it and find ways to work with their politicians. What if the Democratic Party were to just say these 30 members of the House that are our furthest left members, they're not part of our coalition anymore. We agree with them in a bunch of things, but we can't possibly align with them.
Right.
It's just political, self-harm.
It's political malpractice.
You have to actually.
And it's wrong morally. I just want to make that really clear too. That it's not just political. It's morally wrong. The Arab citizens of Israel are equal citizens. They have a vote and they have a say. And to say that they can't take part in the government is just contrary to the values of the state on which it was founded, which said that everybody's equal regardless of their race and their ethnicity and their religion. And it is, not in keeping with our values, and it's not in keeping with the country's founding documents to keep the Arab parties out of the coalition and out of the government. So couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. Now, Netanyahu is going to do everything he can to make it harder for that coalition to happen by just raising the anti-Arab rhetoric, by really ginning it up, by making it harder for somebody like Bennett to go into coalition with Arab parties. And they don't always want to go into coalition with the Jewish parties either, but they need to find some kind of way to do this, because if they do, the election's very, very, very clear. Yeah. If they don't, we can really end up in a stalemate, a mess, some kind of unity government, all kinds of very negative scenarios where Netanyahu is still around, and which is just really a disaster for Israel.
Well, 2026 has a lot of peril and a lot of possibility. It's going to be a fascinating year. We, as J Street, will be kicking it off in Washington, D.C. on February 28th to March 3rd with our first national convention. We used to do a national conference. Now we're calling it a convention. Part of the reason is we're going to do some interesting different programming, including having a live Word on the Street podcast area where all the folks who are speaking on different panels or on our plenary stage are going to come through. You'll be able to watch this on our Word on the Street Substack. But I hope that many of you on this today on the podcast or watching it later will join us in Washington, D.C. From February 28th to March 3rd. It's going to be a great gathering. We will have Mansour Abbas, who's the head of the Arab party, Ram, that we've been talking about. Mansour Abbas is speaking. I believe that Yair Golan, who's the head of the Democrats, is very well likely going to be there. There will be other Israeli civil society leaders, Palestinian leaders, regional leaders, American politicians. It's going to be a great gathering. I'm really looking forward to it, Ilan. This will be the first one that you've been on staff for. I bet you don't even know what to expect.
No, I definitely don't know what to expect. I mean, I've spoken at a couple of these, but this is going to be totally different. But I'm looking forward. I was going to say, Jeremy, you forgot that you buried the lead that you and I are going to be there. I mean, this is
so true. We do not have a choice. This is true.
No,
and I'm getting my whole family to be there too. And I'm sure about a quarter of our audience for these Substacks, by the way, is named Goldenberg. I don't know exactly what all the relationships are. I know it's a common last name, or if it's just a coincidence, but I hope as many of the Goldenberg clan will make it to Washington, D.C. for the conference as make it for our Substack every week.
Oh yeah, there's a few who are going to be coming, so for sure. And yes, it's not that common of a name actually. Goldberg is not more common, so it is. When you see a Goldenberg, you can bet they're probably related to me. But this is, I mean, I know this is a central part of your strategy, Jeremy. Is every J Street staffer ends up with 4 or 5 very active J Street family members. So.
Exactly. That's how you grow. Just grow the staff, grow the family. It's great.
Yeah,
well, listen, everybody, thank you. Thank you to Ilan. It's been a really fun first year of doing this with you. We've really had a blast, and it's really nice of all of you to join us. We appreciate that. Please do share some love for the podcast by hitting the heart button, sharing the link with friends and family. We're here, generally speaking, on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern, and we will get back to that next week. That'll be our return to our normal time, and then we'll start to on a weekly basis after that. So really looking forward to seeing folks in the new year. Wishing you and your families all the best for a very happy new year and for a better year for us here in the United States, for Israelis and Palestinians, and for those all over the world who are at the moment facing the real prospect of conflict and war in their region. So we hope for peace and a better 2026. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ilan.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to everybody.
Now, of course, I have to figure out where the end button is since we're doing this without help. I'm going to try this button here, but great to see everybody.